Okay, welcome to the Resit Revision Guidance session. This is a relatively short lecture which is being podcast, and the purpose is to really show you where you can or how you can use the current materials to help your final bits of revision. So essentially I'm just going to be using documents that we already have published up on Vital. So the week 12 review and revision guidance is really what you need to look at first, because it remains the same for the main exam as it does for the resit exam. And I'm quite aware, the reason I'm going through it again is because I'm quite aware that lots of the people who are resitting the exam were not present at the week 12 revision session. Again, I can only recommend that if you're given revision sessions for modules, that you pay attention to what they're saying, because they usually are very helpful. Okay, if you open up your week 12 revision and guidance, review and revisions guidance session, you will see that there are two parts. There is a part A, which says weeks 8 to 11 review. Now, there is a similar review for weeks 1 to 6, which was given in the week 7 review lecture. Now, also, because I knew that you would use it at the end for revision, I podcasted this review session. So actually, you can watch a podcast of the first 7 weeks review session. What you'll find is within sort of 16, 17 slides, the whole of weeks 1 to 6, topics 1 to 6 are reviewed. And similarly, in this week 12 presentation, again, another 16 to 17 slides, the whole of all of the topics, the remaining topics 4 to 10, which were done over weeks 8 to 11, are also reviewed here. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only thing you therefore need to revise for the exam, but actually it's a really good way of condensing the information into the main points. So what you want to do is ensure you know those, and then go back to the lectures to get a good make sure you have a very good understanding of them. But the main outlines are in here. So if I go through some of these slides here, you can see it starts off here with lecture 8, advertising and branding. There are a couple of slides on advertising and branding, and you'll see that they cover the main points. Indeed, one of the questions, the very first question, was on advertising and branding, and that diagram would have been useful. As you'll see, I'm going to show you that document in a minute. If you'd given that the main information, excuse my phone, if you'd given the main information on those slides, you would have actually got close to a fairly good mark. Okay, so as you can see, topic 9 here, and so on, and I will just skip fast forward to part B. Now, this is the really important information for the exam, because the exam is 2 halves. It's a multiple choice section, and then it's a written answer section. Now, most of you are already pretty good at answering multiple choice questions because you've come across them before. That's just practice. There are still 3 years worth of papers to practice from if you haven't already used those. Even if you have, go through them again, plus the paper you just sat with solutions, and I'll talk about those in a second. So this is the some advice for answering the section B questions, and by far this was where students would lose marks. It's a written section. You have to write answers and bring in your knowledge from across the course. So the 50% MCQs I'm not worried about. Those 20 questions are spread across the full 10 topics. So this exam does actually examine the whole syllabus. Every year I get students sending me emails saying, well, I couldn't attend the revision session. Can you please just tell me which topics to concentrate on? And I'm really shocked when that happens, because we don't do that. A syllabus is a syllabus, and you should be examined from across the syllabus and follow the rules, and you are examined across the syllabus. Now, what you can do is you can specialise a little bit within, because you know that the topics are going to be from across the syllabus. You only have to choose 2 questions from the 4 options from the written section. And because they're across the 10 topics, there are roughly 2 questions from the first part of the course and roughly 2 questions from the second. However, really good answers, of course, there are overlaps. It's spiral learning. But if you found that you enjoyed the neoclassical stuff from the first half of the course better, you like the models, sort of very stiff, rigid models, then you'll be able to specialise more in those. Or if you preferred the stuff in the second half of the course, which was the more applied managerial topics, then again, you can work towards your strengths. But of course, your revision is a game of 2 halves. It's your knowledge across the course for the MCQs, and then it's writing a good answer in the written section, which is where, again, the majority of marks were lost. Okay, so the MCQs are general tests, definitions, diagrams, equilibrium conditions, really seeing if you've fully understood the models. And as you did overall reasonably well, and actually quite well in the mid-term MCQ test, I know you're okay. Now, it's the written answers, and as again, my disclaimer, don't ask me which topics to revise because it's the whole syllabus. Now, a very important piece of advice, which I think was possibly ignored by some of the students, was that you need to have done the workshop questions. I know I kept saying it. You can't expect to go to a gym, watch other people work out, and say, oh, that looks easy, I could do that, and then expect to get fit. And it's the same with any of your studies. Just sort of sitting there, or worse still, not even attending the tutorial workshops to go through the solutions without having tried them first is not going to exercise the muscles that will allow you to write a good answer in an exam. So what I would say is probably the most important thing that you can do now in your remaining time with your revision is, I'm sure that you've been revising the topics as a whole, now you need to be able to answer questions in the written section. So go back to your tutorial questions because they are good examples. Sorry about that. If you can hear something in the background, that's my baby. I have actually just had a baby 3 weeks ago, and he is busily chewing and burping in the background whilst my husband's giving him a bottle. So if there are any random noises, please just ignore them. Okay, so if you've looked at the workshop questions, good, but then have a go at writing them, because you will see when I go back to the main exam that there's a really close correlation to the type of questions you're being asked in the Section B exam to the things you've already practiced in the tutorials. You know, so you it's there, it's on a plate for you in that sense. We don't ask you to just pull things magically out of the air. We have you practice things that are similar. You know, you get the skills as we go along. So there are approximately 4 or 5 questions in each of those 5 tutorial workshops that really had you exercise your thoughts in the way you can answer big, long, written questions. So, for example, the workshop 1 and workshop 5 both looked at when push comes to shove article. Well, it was push up comes to shove. A good answer requires you to address elements from a range of topics. So, really excellent answers, getting really, really high marks, is all about bringing in as much of your knowledge as possible. Basic answers that will get you the marks to pass the exam are you showing that you have understood and can apply theory. So the first thing you want to do when you see a question is to think, okay, what theory, you know, the subject is called theory of the firm, what theory does this want me to talk about? And go ahead and start talking about that theory, because that will start giving you the base marks. the marks that will help you pass the exam. What we look for when we learn is a sort of spiral learning where you learn main concepts and then you learn to take things that have happened in managerial research and apply them. So that's really where managerial theory has come from. We've started off with basic economics, which has been applied to the microeconomics has been applied to business. And from that neoclassical economics, then a lot of the managerial theories have been applied. So it's kind of building on earlier learning. This is the standard way that academia works. So you'll often get your main chunks of marks for showing that you understand the base theory. So whenever you read the question in the exam, think to yourself, okay, what are the base theories that this wants me to explain? Go ahead and explain them, and then start adding your examples, etc. on top of that. So my tips for good section B answers: make sure you can draw and explain the main diagrams. And how do you know that they're the main diagrams? Well, they're in the review sessions. So they're in the lecture 7 revision session and they're in the lecture 12 revision session. That way you know that they are the main diagrams and models that you need to know. Secondly, be sure you can give good definitions and find or explain equilibrium conditions. Economics, neoclassical economics, is all about the equilibrium. Your supply and demand gives you an equilibrium. When you draw an outcome for a profit, for a monopoly firm, or for a firm in perfect competition, there's always the point that's the equilibrium. In that sense, you find the point where marginal cost equals marginal benefit. Every diagram will give you an outcome. And be sure you can actually give definitions or find those equilibrium outcomes. Now, thirdly, I'll say do the reading. At this point, if you haven't done the reading, it's probably a bit of a tall order to add it. So I've put in brackets, at least have some case study examples for things you'll talk about. They don't have to be the things that we included in the course. Quite often when we were talking during the lectures, other things popped up, other examples. Any examples that you can give, that you can think of, are relevant, because this is theory that's then applied to the real world. So you're not limited by anything that we've done in the course. If you can think of an example, then you can put it down. So again, tip 4, I seem to be flogging the dead horse here, but you should be able to answer any of the tutorial questions if they came up in an exam or something like them. If you skimped on the preparation for the tutorials, then there's no getting around it. You just need to catch up, as nothing was wasted in our tutorial sessions. They were very much focused on the analytical skills and examples for them. So that will be one way you can very quickly radically improve your ability in section B for the exam, is to go over those tutorial questions. So your revision is 5 steps. Refer to your lecture notes and fill out any gaps. Don't try and learn slides full of statistics. They were there to paint pictures of markets for you. Otherwise you'd be learning all sorts of nonsense. You need to be able to show that you understand and can apply the theory of the firm. You should have pursued step 2, the additional reading, or the case studies. But essentially any examples that you have will work for getting those extra marks. Think of it as a ladder. You get a big chunk of the marks for showing you know the theory, and then anytime you start applying it or you start giving examples, tick, you can farm extra marks. Step 3, for lecture weeks 8 to 11, it was important not to limit yourself to one textbook view. I know quite a lot of students like to pick a textbook and go from that, but actually the course notes were written from the whole variety of sources that I referenced in the lecture. So that was quite a bunch of textbooks, and it was also a lot of empirical research as well. So one textbook will not cover a whole syllable for theory of the firm, because it is an applied and practical subject. So I've given you examples there. Step 4, use those tutorial questions as practice for planning out detailed answers. So a good way to think about things is, if you're going to have a go at a question in section B, you're probably going to have to draw a diagram or at least give a model and then apply examples. But also, don't limit yourself to the materials covered in one topic week. If the theory, you can then say, well, we could also consider this, then great, consider that as well. And my final tip is to put yourself in the examiner's shoes and go through the topics and ask yourself questions. Think to yourself, what question could an examiner ask me? So I gave the example for lecture 1. What kind of things could I be asked in section B for lecture 1? Well, that mainly covered the economic problem and the nature of the firm. So the kind of things I could be asked about are the marginal nature of consumers and producers' decision making, that marginal cost equals marginal benefit business, the idea of opportunity cost. I could also be asked about the scope of firms, Cozy theory, and that's exactly what you are asked about in the main exam in January. You are asked basically to describe Cozy's transactions cost theory. Thirdly, you could be asked about why businesses structure themselves the way they do, the main alternatives being the U form and the M form. We saw a massive transition at the end of the last century from U form towards M form. So the questions that you could be asked there are the same things that would be brought up, even though you could be asked different, in inverted commas, questions. They are all questions on those 3 aspects. So really, even though the question might look different, it's still asking you to cover the same material. Now you can do the same thing for lecture 2. And what you'll find is there's a relatively few questions that are generally then asking you, eliciting you, if you like, to talk about the theory. So I'm not trying to fail you. It's great. As happened with the multiple choice section, the average mark was well over 60. It was really high, and it's fine. That was justified. Those questions were considered tough enough for a second year course by a very tough external examiner, and lots and lots of students got firsts and 2-1s from that midterm. So that's fine. If that's the case, I will support the marks. However, I can only give you marks for what you give me. Okay? So that was me showing you through the advice for the exam. Now let me just stop sharing this document and prove to you that the lecture 7 stuff also has a set of revision slides. So this will just load up if you will give it a second. And as I say, this review from week 7 also was podcast. So that's the 1 to 6. You can see lecture 1 slide, firm structure. Oh, 2 slides, 2 slides to revise the main aspects from lecture 1. And then you can go back and fill in some of the details. So I would really recommend at this point you just go through each lecture 1, go through those 2 revision slides from week 7 review session, and then ask yourself, do I know what that means? Could I put it in an answer? And go back and fill in the details from the lecture. And do that for each of the lectures. There are only 10 topics that were taught over the course. And you can see that, for example, with things like lecture 2, where you have technical stuff, I've put in a summary of the technical stuff. Really summarise things and applied things here. See, lecture 2, drawing product characteristics example. If you go away from passively looking at them to actually drawing one, you can learn a lot more in detail. And again, here's me applying some questions about market equilibrium from lecture 4. So as I say, go through that podcast. That will really, really help you. And then use the lecture 12 section A slides to revise the managerial topics as well. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to do was to point out what happened in the exam. So let me flip over to the exam solutions. So these have now been loaded up on Vital. They were loaded up on Vital straight after the exam period had ended. In fact, the very first opportunity that we were permitted. And what you'll see is that the multiple choice questions not only have the answers, but also some explanations of where they've come from to help you out if you're having any problems finding them. So please do review those and see where you went wrong. And again, use the previous papers. There are 3 years worth, so there are 6 papers, plus this paper makes 7 papers for you to practice from. Now when we get to section B, you will see that, as I said before, very first question, explain Coase's theory of the firm. Be sure to include an explanation of transactions costs both in markets and internally. And then I've got a little solution written out here that shows you the kind of things that you could have covered in your answer. And if you'd covered all of these points, you would have gotten a very good mark indeed. In fact, a number of students do very, very well in this course. There's no trick to it. It's explain the theory and apply the theory, and you will get the marks. Question 2, again, you may recognise this question because it was there in your tutorials. We practiced an example just like this in the tutorials, showing how to just use generic cost curves to illustrate something and do a few very basic calculations to calculate out the situation of the firm. Not completely onerous, but probably if you hadn't attempted the tutorial questions beforehand. So again, thing that can really improve your answer is to look at those tutorial questions. Question 3, again, as I said, we went through this in the tutorial sessions. Explain the following using diagrams or formulas where necessary. Diagrams you get marks for, explaining them you get marks for. Again, this was in the review session slides, it was in the tutorial slides. There was no reason why you shouldn't have known this for the main exam if you'd followed those simple rules of reviewing and revising the tutorials and using the reviews, that's lecture week 7 and lecture week 12, to do your revision. And then of course finally question 4, again in the tutorials we applied Dunning's paradigm, so you could have used the example we did in the tutorial, which was for IBM, or you could have chosen any example you liked. And indeed, I was very heartened that students, especially those who were scoring sort of 80s and 90s in the exam, were giving me all sorts of examples. They were looking at companies that we looked at, like Amazon. They were looking at companies like Apple. Any company that you might know something about can be used as an example in answering these questions. Do not limit yourself in any way. Once you've got the theory, we can apply it to any examples. So, the other last thing that I would like you to do, let me just stop sharing that one and get the last document up. The last document is also available on the Vital in the exam feedback, and that is a document that's called Feedback on the January examination. And what it does is it literally goes through questions, the written questions, and it talks about where students, it goes through all of the questions, so it goes through the multiple choice questions first, and it says the mistakes that students made. Now, this may not be useful for you for the multiple choice, so if we skip forward questions 1 to 10, questions 11 to 20, and then we go to the section B, this may actually be more used to you. Again, I remark that where students really tripped up tended to be in the section B. So, see, it says where marks were low, it was because not enough was written for the answers in the sections. many students offering little more than a summary. When I say many, I'm meaning of those students that didn't do well. Some even put carbon copies of previous exam outline answers. You're not supposed to be writing an outline answer. You're supposed to be writing a written answer. I very much put that in bold in the tutorial 5 feedback, that we use bullet points so we can be concise in giving outline answers, but that's not okay for you to do in an exam. You need to actually give me a written coherent answer. Obviously, if you start running out of time, get as much down as possible, but you need to actually give a written response. A lot of students opted to answer questions 2 and 3 on the paper. Question 2 is very technical, and therefore would be considered one of the more difficult questions. And I was a bit surprised, and quite happily surprised, that so many students had a go at it. And I think that was because they'd actually practiced a similar question in the tutorials. So I was very happy that the cohort did very well with those. But I was surprised by how few students answered question 1, which was a straightforward description of Coase's theory. So again, look at previous exam questions, because you'll find that they are just generic adaptations of things that are discussed within each lecture. And within each lecture, only a maximum of 2 or 3 themes are actually covered. In fact, in many of the neoclassical lectures, it's really just one thing that's being discussed. So you can really hone your revision. So I would really recommend that you spend 5 minutes having a look at the feedback. Maybe not so much for the multiple choice there, but there's only one A4 side there on why students did well or didn't do well in questions 1 to 4. So if you haven't already reviewed that, that might also help you. Okay, so that really brings us to the end of this session. I said it was going to be brief. It's really more signposting the things that you can do now to really help your marks. And again, let me just reiterate, use the lecture 7 and the lecture 12 revision sections and have a go at those tutorial questions and really have a focus on those, because they will help you no end with the section B questions. Again, the question board is open between, as it has been. It's been quite quiet, I've noticed, but I'm guessing that the revision questions are really going to get serious in the next 2 weeks before the exam. So please use that and ask me your revision questions. That's it. Again, I am available for email for more personal questions, but I would prefer it if you asked your questions in the online question boards, if they're just general questions, because that means that other students can read them as well. And in fact, you can go to the question board. If I can share my screen. Will it let me share my screen? Yes, it will let me share my screen. If I go into Vital here and go into questions and discussion, you can see that on this forum, you can actually search for things. So if I press search, then somebody may have already answered your question, so then you'll quickly get an answer to it. Usually you'll find that students will have the same kind of questions. If you have a question, it's probably not just you. It's something that other students have thought before. Okay, let me go back to my screen, and I will bring this revision session to an end now. Okay, very best of luck for the resit examination and for your future studies.